Welcome to Season 2 of OnListening. This is your host, Daniel Rosen. Thank you for joining us as we continue to explore listening in all its dimensions. Continue listening after the interview is over for some information about engagement with the show. Thank you. On the next episode of OnListening, I'm pleased to have Alli O'Malley, Rochester-based domestic violence advocate, on the show. Welcome, Alli.
Well, hello. Good to be here.
Good to be here. And we are doing an interesting thing. We did an episode, and we rather than edit it, we wanted to just do it over again, do it better. So we're going to talk about listening as it pertains to how we talk. Reflection is a big part of listening, and so we each reflected on it. Alli, what is a domestic violence advocate?
Well, we're working toward ending domestic violence. So the work that I have done for the last decade was with an organization called Resolve of Greater Rochester, and we were providing transitional support to survivors of domestic violence who were not necessarily in the heat of the crisis, but on the other side of it and trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives or how to create a new life on the other side of that experience. And so my work has been largely focused on working directly with survivors, but my interest is really in how do we prevent it from happening in the first place. I feel like we will be working with survivors until the end of time if we don't do something to change the paradigm that allows it to continue to exist. Okay,
so the immediate urgent work is often helping somebody whose life has been disrupted, but we're looking for more systemic change. And of course, that's what's in the air now around the anti-racism work, is changing a system, not just any one individual act. Any individual act, criminal taking of a life is heinous, but we want to try to change the system. And I think you're talking about systemic changes. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The dynamics are so similar to what's happening in the world of anti-racism and what we also need to accomplish in violence against women specifically, but I would go so far as to say violence in family systems, because that's really where all of the community violence starts, is if it's happening in the home, it's transferring over into the streets, and it's a gigantic problem and one that we really don't want to look at.
I like that. Violence within families, violence within families. And we talked last time about the term domestic violence advocate. People know the words for domestic violence from previous. It's sort of been in the lexicon, American speak. Right. But what would be sort of a more comprehensive way to describe what's the words we're using now to say what this problem is?
Well, there's really a couple different phrases that I like better. Intimate partner violence is really the space where I've done the majority of my work. So it has to do with violence and abuse in relationships that are intimate in nature. And then also really the dynamic of violence in families. So family violence, I think, is a more inclusive term. When we talk domestic violence, that's really an old term. It infers to that domestic relationship, which kind of automatically subjugates the woman in this case to a secondary position. She's the domestic. So we need to really think about how do we begin to reframe that terminology and help the general people in the community to understand it better.
Fantastic. So thank you for that. So for everyone who's joining us, I think this is an important conversation, and Alli has a lot of experience in multiple ways with interpersonal violence. I keep saying interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence.
Right. They are different, but that's an important, can I comment on that real quickly? Please. Interpersonal violence is really violence that happens between any two people. So that could be street crime. That could be a mugging. That's interpersonal. It's person to person, but there isn't a familiar relationship between those people. So intimate partner violence assumes that there is a familial or a familiar relationship between the parties.
Or at least a desire for that, someone stalking.
Or at least a desire, exactly. Yeah, right. Correct.
Okay, Thank you. So when I proposed you coming on the show, you said you had something to say. You wanted to talk about it, and in particular, the lens of listening, who we listen to, or how we listen, or what listening is involved in some way, and trying to root out this systemic and individualized problem of inter-family, intimate partner violence.
Right.
So what would you like to share?
Well, I think what I found compelling about the idea of this particular podcast is that if we're going to be effective in addressing intimate partner violence or family violence, we really need to start from a place of listening. And that is what the systems are not doing today. The systems are really busy telling people what they need to do to get free of violence or abusive relationships. And they're not listening to what the victims and even the offenders necessarily have to say about what's really going on in this relationship. And so we make a lot of assumptions about what's right for people. And when we do that, we wonder why people don't choose differently, because we're not listening to them. We have to listen to them to help them figure out what their path forward is. We really can't prescribe that path. And the current systems that address intimate partner violence are very prescriptive in nature, and that's why they are failing.
Okay, 3 things I want to deconstruct. One is what the system is doing wrong. I want you to get to that, and I want you to describe what you'd like to see happen. And then you used the word choose, and I think that there's some unpacking of that. I think you were I won't say what I was thinking. I'll let you talk about that. So what's the system doing that's not right? What do you want to see it do? And what did you mean when you said we focus on a choice?
So really, since domestic violence became known, which largely occurred in the 1970s, we have been addressing it by swooping in, rescuing the person that we perceive to be the victim, telling them that it's not their fault, dusting them off, and telling them to get on with their life. The number one question that's been asked since domestic violence kind of entered the lexicon, which wasn't in the earliest days, but probably in the 80s and 90s, when people became aware of domestic violence in a broader sense, they would say, well, why doesn't she just leave? That's almost always the question that's asked. And when we're coming at this issue from that perspective, the very first thing that we're doing is blaming the victim for what's happening to them.
Yeah, you have to explain how, right, so how is that blaming the victim? And I apologize for jumping in so quick. At worst, I'd be accurately accused of interrupting, but what you're saying is so rich that we won't be able to parse it in small chunks if I don't jump in.
Sure, it's no problem. So why is that question almost accusatory? Because that really is how it lands on a person who has experienced domestic violence. It says, you're staying in this relationship and being abused because you're choosing it. And that's really not true. The person who is choosing to offend, the person who's choosing to do harm, whether it's emotional harm or physical harm, sexual harm, is the one who's making the choice to do wrong by the victim. So the better question would be, why does the offender think it's okay? Right? And we never ask that question. We always point at the victim and ask, why are you choosing to be abused? Which is not an accurate perspective on the issue. And it holds the victim responsible for the behavior of the person who's harming them. So that's why I say that it's victim blaming. And victim blaming can be a term that really gets people upset, but it really is in its truest sense. If I am committed to this relationship because I believe in the person that's hurting me, maybe I have seen that person's pain in other ways and I want to help them, and they choose to hurt me, and I don't understand yet that that's not okay. I may need education. I may need to understand that maybe I don't have the power to fix this person that maybe I believed when I entered this relationship. And we hear that a lot in particularly teen dating relationships, but we also hear it in adult relationships where the victim will describe staying in the relationship because they're afraid of what will happen to this person if they're not there. They'll describe, this person's great except for this one thing and I can change that, or the power of our love can change that. So sometimes people just have ideas that aren't really accurate about the level of influence they can actually exert over their partner.
That was a great answer.
Good, I'm glad. I've been doing this a while. But it's true.
I want to go back to the first part of it. It was a great answer, but the first part that maybe is in some ways the most important part is that even if the advice is offered or the question is asked with the most intense sense of love, like we can easily see a parent who loves their child like no one else saying, why don't you just leave him? Right? It's delivered with love. But it is, and you said it's the way the victim hears it. Mm-hmm. And we have to know, if we want to understand how people operate, their responsivity, what they hear. It might be so different from what someone intended. Of course, there could be some harmful intent in why don't you just leave? But there can also be love, like you don't want that person to be hurt.
Right. Or you don't want them to hurt themselves, because that's another piece of this work that a lot of people don't realize. Abuse can look like your partner saying, if you leave me, I will kill myself. That's a powerful way of controlling someone and keeping them in a relationship. And, you know, one of your point a minute ago about the way the question is asked, as you are aware, your listeners may not be, but I am also a survivor of intimate partner violence. I also grew up with it in my home. So I was a childhood. I experienced it as a child, a witness to it. And when I decided to get into therapy, you know, I didn't identify at all with being a domestic violence victim in my first marriage. I didn't understand that the abuse that I was enduring was actually abuse, because I mistook it for loving behavior, because it was really all I'd ever known. And I found my way not to a hotline or not to, a domestic violence program, because I didn't identify with that, but I found my way into a therapist's office. And after about 3 visits with that therapist, the question that I was asked was, do you know that that's abuse? And that question was a game changer. It was an absolute game changer. It didn't accuse me of anything. It didn't make me feel stupid. It said, are you aware that it asked me to look at my experience, and it allowed me to shine a light on something that I hadn't been able to see before that was really hidden from me. And it was a horrible question, quite frankly, because it was really hard to confront that. But in doing
horrible in that it was painful, or do you think there's a better question?
No, horrible in that it was painful, right? It's one of those really good therapist questions that makes you really stop and reflect on your life. And my answer was no, I didn't know that. And then we were able to start a conversation about, what does loving relationship look like, and what does an abusive relationship look like? And that started me down a path of really genuine healing for myself. You know, it allowed me to reconcile all that I'd ever really known in relationships to people, whether it was a parent or an intimate partner. And it allowed me to start thinking that maybe I was valuable and I didn't have to tolerate mistreatment. So it was a very, very painful but powerful redirect that was helpful. And if more people would ask that question instead of saying, why do you just stay? Why don't you just leave? And say, I'm concerned about you. And geez, that sounds kind of abusive to me. That lands on a person as you care about me, and maybe there's something for me to look at here. It's very different.
Super helpful information. And
I think when people, if anyone listening happens to know somebody who's in a relationship that concerns them, maybe they've heard arguments happen, or they've heard about them after the fact, and something is just telling them that things aren't right in this relationship. One of the mistakes that we make when we become afraid or scared for people that we care about is we just want to jump in and fix it. And we can't do that. And oftentimes what happens with a domestic violence victim is if somebody else, like a parent or a friend, really gets in the victim's corner and says, I'm going to protect you, I'm going to make this right, this is not okay, it pushes them back to the abuser. And it's really counterintuitive. But the victim inherently knows that they can't expose their perpetrator, or it puts them in danger. So they'll pull away from the person. Yeah. So they'll pull away from the person who's trying to help them, and they'll align with the person who's hurting them. And that's really hard to watch if you're a mom and you're worried about your son or daughter, or, if your best friend is in a bad situation and all of a sudden they won't communicate with you anymore. So
there's a phrase that I've heard, dysfunctional rescue.
Yeah.
It's an attempt to help. So I want to go, I can't let this opportunity go. So if you're not going to fix, right, if that's not going to be helpful, that's potentially a dysfunctional rescue, then we're listening, right? We're listening. As painful as it is to hear a story, we stay in contact with the person who's hurting and let them talk about it. Is that right?
That is right. And that's so important. That's the single most important thing that we can do for somebody who we suspect or even know is in a violent or abusive relationship, is allow them to tell you their stories. Don't judge them. However, it is okay to say, this isn't the first time I've heard you talk like this. And I feel a little bit scared for you when I hear that. That is a gentle way of letting them know that you're paying attention. And, as and when the time comes that they're ready to do something, they know that you're going to be a safe person to come to. It's a delicate balance, and it's really hard to do. I'm not suggesting that it's easy, but to say, I've heard this from you before, and I'm so sorry this is happening to you, and it makes me really sad, or it makes me feel afraid. Is there something you might want to do about it? So, going back with questions instead of issuing ultimatums or doing that kind of unhealthy rescuing that you were talking about. Dysfunctional rescuing.
So if I reflect back on some of the earlier episodes, it's so easy to have a story in your head and to listen to that story rather than listening to what the person's saying, because they're rarely saying, it does happen, but it's very rare someone is like, save me.
Right.
Right. Let me stay in your house, call the police for me, or whatever. It's the much less, the direct request for assistance is usually not there, at least in my experience.
You know what? I think that's an interesting point, because here's another thing about learning to listen and understand, and how to partner with somebody who might be living with domestic violence. If the person is aware that the relationship is violent or abusive and is starting to think about making changes, from the outside looking in, we want them to make those changes fast, right? And that comes from our place of fear and anxiety for this person.
Yes.
The person who's living with the violent or abusive person knows that person, and they know, in essence, their rhythms. They know when they're going to step on a time bomb. They know how to step on a time bomb, and they know how to avoid it. And allowing them to maintain control over what the end of that relationship looks like, to some degree anyway, whether that means I've decided to ask this person for a divorce and I need somebody who's going to know what's going on. You know, like, I'm afraid and I need for you to know that this is what I'm doing. And, you know, if you haven't heard from me, please give me a call, or that kind of thing. Like, you know, working together with that person can be really, really helpful with the victim if the victim says that to you. Sometimes the victim isn't really ready to end the relationship yet, but they know that things are really unstable. Maybe they're getting to a point where they feel like they can't manage the other person anymore. And they may reach out to a neighbor and say, you know, if you get a text from me with this word, I need you to call 911. You know, so there are things that victims will do in terms of trying to safety plan, if you will, and create allies in a support system that doesn't look like I'm walking out the door tomorrow, but here are some early steps that I'm ready and willing to take. And those are valuable.
I found in my clinical work that people who have been traumatized in some kind of either intimate partner or other, usually intimate partner, family violence, if they get to stop it, if they're the agent of change, whether that's a teenage boy who's being physically abused by his father, keeps telling himself, one day I'm going to punch my father in the nose. And there's many stories where that was the day it ended, as crazy as that sounds. Mm-hmm. The sense of agency. So taking that sense of agency that I did it away from someone, I think can interrupt their healing. They need to do it.
Yeah, and I think we see that over and over again. I mean, kind of the kitchen table wisdom around the issue of domestic violence is once a victim, always a victim. They'll go from one perpetrator to the next, and they'll always be in abusive relationships. And, you know, with all kind of kitchen table wisdom, there is always a little bit of truth to that, right? If a person leaves an abusive or violent relationship and it really isn't on their terms, they haven't seen what they want in their future, then they're probably going to repeat that pattern.
Oh, that's beautiful. That is one of the best. I just love hearing that, the way you said that. That's right. You have to envision your own future. We have to be the architects of our own future. So you talked about the kernel of wisdom, the kernel of truth in that. Hey, I think we have some pretty good evidence that exploitive and manipulative people are pretty good at identifying people who are vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So a person who's come out of a relationship where they've been psychologically or physically, emotionally beaten down is vulnerable, plain and simple. Mm-hmm. They usually don't come out financially on the best footing. They come out bruised in so many ways. And then you have somebody else who just has radar for that. Mm-hmm. There's people who just have radar for that. And mm-hmm. so we can, again, like, blame the perpetrator, right? The perpetrators may initiate some kind of a romantic conversation with 10 people. And the vulnerable ones may respond in a way that they're like, oh, yeah, mm-hmm. right. There we go. There's my next mark.
That's right. Right. Even if it's not, and the one thing I want to say about that, though, is even if it's not, if they're not aware that they're doing it, right? So I think a lot of times we want to make offenders the boogeyman. You know, we want to make them predatory in nature, and they're not always that. Sometimes right. I think offenders are broken too. And
Well,
they're
that is going to be
looking-
the second. That's definitely the second half. I know we're about to get to that. And I feel I have to correct myself a little bit. I was speaking more about a particular variety of intentionally exploitive person. But you're right. There's a ton of inadvertent exploitive. There's people who are vulnerable, right? A lot of the people who are perpetrators are vulnerable themselves. I know you're going to talk about that because we talked about this before.
Yes.
So we're going to talk about that, and that's just a great. Thank you for turning on that. Perfect timing.
Great. Yeah.
So
go ahead.
Tell us the sort of, it's not exactly the other side because many people are perpetrators, have been victims in other circumstances, but what's the sort of the if you were to listen to the voice of the person who's been harming somebody else, what are we learning? And I think you know what I'm talking about. What's the other side of this?
So, as I mentioned earlier, having lived through this myself, and in fact, coming to recognize that, my father was really my greatest teacher and the biggest offender in my life, unfortunately. And he's gone now, but he, I don't know that he certainly wasn't an intentional abuser. He, as I've come to reconcile my experience growing up, as the child, not as the direct victim. I mean, my mother was victimized, but I, wasn't always, it didn't always happen in front of me. It was a lot more emotional, psychological kind of violence, occasionally physical, but he was so desperate to create this facade of a perfect life. And so I was the firstborn in our family.
There's a lot of pressure.
Whole lot of pressure on the firstborn. And he always wanted a boy as the firstborn. So there was this latent disappointment that he had a girl as his firstborn. I think one of his proudest moments was when I learned to throw a really good spiral. He was super proud of that with a football. But he reconciled the fact that I wasn't a boy, I was a girl, but he really could never see where he ended and I began. He could never see me as a separate person. So when I made a mistake, as kids do, that's like the whole experience of childhood, is making mistakes and learning from them. His reaction was so extreme because it wasn't just a reflection on him. It was like he did it. And when I excelled at something, he was so glorified, by the fact that I had excelled at something. And it was like he was living through me, kind of like that stage mother kind of, or stage father kind of approach to things, really pushing your kids to do great in a highly visible way so that everybody sees you as an amazing parent, or living out your dreams through your children. And, parents do that in a variety of different ways, but my father, it was really distorted for him. And I became so attuned to pleasing him that when I got into my first intimate relationship, I carried that same need to be attuned all the time because I felt like I was responsible for my partner's happiness. Because I was always responsible for my father's happiness. So, again, did he maliciously or intentionally harm me? I don't really believe so. But he didn't ever feel like he was enough. And so he took that out on me.
That's very moving. I really feel a lot of compassion for you, and I hear stories like this in the therapy office, and I have to say, I think throughout this conversation periodically, I've said good or that was great, and that's actually a misnomer. it's emotionally moving for me. I don't want to be hierarchical about it. There's a couple of, also the way you described the untangled, blaming the victim. Very, had a strong emotional response to hearing the way you've articulated some of these things.
Well, thank you. And, when you say that, what I hear that maybe I'm not saying real clearly for people who are listening is I loved my father, right? And all I ever wanted was to experience being loved by him. I loved my ex-husband. And when he became violent and abusive, all I wanted was for him to feel like he was okay because I loved him, at least to the extent that I knew how to define love then, right? And my definition was fairly limited compared to what I know love to be now, on the other side of abusive and at times violent relationships. So, and I think when we don't listen to victims and even offenders, that's the piece we miss. There's a perception, and for the victim, a very real experience to the extent that they understand love, of loving this person. Very often. Certainly there are cases where they're just done and they want to get out and they just need to be validated in their anger. But at the earliest stages, there really is a legitimate kind of bond, a love connection. And there's lots of language about love bombing, the way that offenders can do that to really manipulate their victims who maybe so desperately want to feel loved that they are susceptible to, overt and big kind of loving behaviors. Right. Yeah, big displays of love.
But are you also saying that if we look systemically about the unmet needs within the perpetrator, that we might look, on one hand, it's a manipulative thing to send flowers and buy a car and, all kinds of stuff. But also that person is desperate to feel loved and they feel like they would be bereft and completely abandoned and alone without their partner. And so they're trying to cure themselves, not just manipulate. Is that true? Or is it?
Yes, I absolutely think that's true.
I cheated. I had my other episode.
in a lot of, when I was working with offenders and you listen to them describe what's at stake for them in this relationship, it isn't just about ownership. When we delve into kind of the feminist lens on intimate partner violence, we go really quickly to patriarchy and to, the man feels like he owns his partner and therefore he can do whatever he wants. That is present in a lot of cases. But in many cases, it really is this, I need this person. This person is maybe the only person who's ever been nice to me, ever. And I don't, I take such comfort in having them around. And then they don't recognize sometimes that their behavior, when they come home in a bad mood and take it out on their partner, or, far worse, come home drunk and beat their partner, or, even do that in a sober condition. And then they, particularly if that's early on in the relationship, many offenders feel tremendous remorse, but they don't know where to go for help. And that's another big gap in our system, is we don't have places that are easy for men to go for help. And we need to,
why
to
not,
address
why not,
that too.
So why can't guys do what you did? You just, you simplified it probably, but essentially you went to a private practice. You went to a therapist. Why can't guys do that?
They certainly can, but I think there's still a lot of stigma around men reaching out for a therapist, reaching out for therapy. In the research on domestic violence and looking at men and women, there was a really fascinating study done through Kaiser Permanente in about 2008 that looked at a considerable size study. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was a good sample of victims and offenders in the healthcare system. And what they found with the offenders is that their costs of healthcare went up exorbitantly over time and just continued to increase because of all the pharmaceuticals and because of the likelihood that they would end up having some sort of major cardiac event. But so many of them were on antidepressants, and like lifelong antidepressants and supplemented antidepressants, because they wouldn't get into talk therapy. They wouldn't go see a therapist. There was just too much stigma around doing that. They just wanted a pill to fix it. The men just wanted to feel better. Where we would see a spike in women's healthcare costs during victimization and immediately post, when they were trying to figure out how to heal and get through their life, but their expenditures were in supportive services as well as drugs. But then it would come back down once they kind of found their way through a healing process and they didn't need to stay on antidepressants anymore. So there is a difference between the way men and women, the availability or the perception of access to mental health care.
I wonder if non-male perpetrators of intimate partner violence are more responsive to treatment, or don't have that same spike, because we didn't explicitly say it, but we want to be clear that not all intimate partner violence is in a heterosexual cis-male, cis-female relationship.
Right. That's a great question, and there's just not enough research yet for us to really understand the longer term effects of particularly perpetration in LGBTQ spectrum. We don't have enough data at this point. We know that rates of violence in the LGBTQ community the rates are higher than they are in heterosexual or cisgendered relationships, particularly in trans relationships. That the numbers are really startling in that continuum, as much as kind of more than 50% of relationships with trans people result in physical violence in particular, and sexual violence.
So tell us again why we need to listen to the voices of the perpetrators.
I think we need to listen to the voices of both parties, and I don't think we're doing a great job listening on either side. Where I think it's important that we start listening to the voices of offenders is the system has largely focused only on accountability for offenders. So it's a punishment-based system. So we're punishing violence with another form of punishment, right? And while I do agree wholeheartedly that an offender needs to be accountable for their behavior before we really dig into why they've gone down a path of choosing to be abusive or violent with their partner, where I think we've really done a disservice to offenders is we have not systemically created a system that would allow an offender who has taken accountability for their behavior to then get the emotional support that they need to figure out how to change in an intentional, purposeful way going forward. We haven't done that. And, you can't ask particularly a male offender to go through a 26-week long program where they're learning to confront their behavior, but then not support them in changing that behavior going forward. It's not reasonable.
I just want to interrupt for a sec to close the loop. When you use the word accountability, it's almost got a capital A. Accountability so judges will mandate treatment. People will be mandated to treatment, and the focus of the treatment is accountability. It's intentionally not an attempt at a psychotherapy to treat or cure. It's not a personality thing. It's a behavioral intervention, educational intervention.
That is correct. However, what you're saying is absolutely correct. The problem, though, is that the evaluations that have been done on offender programs attempt to evaluate them as therapeutic interventions, and they're not. So the data always comes back and says these programs are not effective. They don't evaluate them as accountability programs. So that's part of the systemic problem. That's part of the systemic problem.
To get back to your point, though, you're saying that it's almost, I mean, you suggest it's sort of unfair, but it's the minimum standard we have. But to send someone to a program, they plead guilty, or there's some kind of legal resolution, and then there's a sentence, or the equivalent of a sentence, which is you do the program. And you're saying we need to have supports on top of that, beyond that, because once people start to look at themselves in the mirror, then they're very prone to go back to offending behavior because it's systemically wired in them, similar to the pattern, I think you're suggesting, similar to the pattern that being easily, not easily, but that you were sort of wired from your family of origin to try to please, and that made you vulnerable to interfamilial
Intimate
violence.
partner.
Intimate partner. I'm just not going to get that one right. Intimate partner violence. These guys have a sort of programming that leads them in the same way to be the perpetrators of that intimate partner violence. Right.
And so just to build on that for a minute, when I think about, and I'm going to speak about my own experience, I am fortunate to be somebody who really has broken this cycle in my life. I just celebrated my 22nd wedding anniversary with my second husband. And when I think about those early days of choosing to be in a relationship with someone again, I was still very much in therapy at that point, and I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust myself to choose wisely. And if I had not had kind of that background support system where I could go in and say, this feels good, and this is what's happening. And I had this safe person that I could communicate with to say, it sounds like you're on the right track. You're making, you are aware of kind of, you're entering into this relationship with your eyes wide open. I mean, I tested him. God love him that he's still with me all these years later. But I mean, I really, I tested to make sure that this was really what I thought it was, because, I really didn't want to be hurt again. And I still am innately a pleaser. That's just kind of part of my makeup. And that's not a bad thing as long as I'm with somebody who doesn't take advantage of it. And that can be hard to sort out when you have only ever really known that one experience. So when I think about how do we prevent intimate partner violence in the future, it has to start with how do we actually address those who are offending? And we're not addressing those that are offending today. And if somebody had asked me then, when I heard that question, did you know that that's abuse? It started me down a road of evaluating my life and my experiences. And nobody ever said to me, you need to leave that relationship. But I came to that on my own because he wasn't in therapy too, right? And we actually did try that. I tried to get him to go to therapy, but he wasn't having it. He wasn't ready. And that was where that ended up. But if, really my first choice at that point in time would have been help me help him somehow. Because I loved him and, I wanted him to be okay. And
what's the equivalent question? So you said your therapist said to you, did you know that's abuse? What's the equivalent? Let's say a man is ready for therapy or has a conversation with a friend. You also talked about conversation with a friend. What's the equivalent kind of question or statement to a guy who says, I got a little carried away last night, or I'm I'm having some regret about the way I behaved.
First of all, I think that's interesting, but I don't think most of the time a man is going to say that to another man. In my limited experience, you've talked to a lot more men than I have. However, what we do know is that men will say stuff like that to their doctor, and doctors need to know how to respond to that, and they generally don't. But so if a man were to express concern about their behavior in the context of their relationship, intimate relationship,
yes,
I would think that a good question back to them would be, what do you want to do about it? Is that something that you would be interested in changing? Is that a dynamic that you're interested in changing? And then see where that goes. But I mean, again, they need agency too. The whole idea behind a mandate, it's the same with substance abuse. You mandate someone into a substance abuse program, you might get them in a place where they're ready to do something about it, and the mandate pushed them over and they were ready to act. But the majority of the time, they're going to be in treatment again because they really weren't committed to stop using, right? So mandates are really challenging. You can't force anybody to do anything. And, the consequence of going to jail isn't always the consequence that is motivating to people. That sounds strange to people looking in from the outside who would never want to go to jail, but it's just really not that simple.
Well, I appreciate you taking a stab at that question, because I think you're right that fewer people seem to volunteer that they're concerned about how they're behaving towards somebody else, but we want to know how to listen in a way that helps somebody at a moment where there might be a chance of building some relationship to help them get out of that dynamic or to do something about it or to own it in a way.
Well, what I do think, and this is certainly not all, this is not all men. Absolutely not. But I'm going to make a generalization. Many of the men who I saw in the program, the court-mandated program that I facilitated, would describe having an incident with their partner, leaving the home after the incident, showing up at a bar, and then telling, kind of anybody who would listen, whether they were friends or just people that they met in the bar, what they just did. And wouldn't it be fascinating if the response to that wasn't to affirm them, which is normally what happens that in that particular setting, to say, that's not okay. We need men to know how to talk to other men.
I agree.
And that's a skill that we largely haven't developed in American culture anyway. So,
although there's people working on changing versions of masculinity, and people who, as therapy trainers, their focus is on reaching men.
Yes, yeah, we had that program in what we called the stand-up guys locally here in Rochester. That was one of my programs at Resolve. So,
well, as you reflect on this session, is there anything you want to clarify? Or comment on?
I think when I think about the issue of intimate partner violence or violence in families, listening is really the missing piece. And I think it's really important that we not, as family members, as community members, when we're hearing about this on the news, that we, as you alluded to earlier, we don't go to that story in our head. We listen to the story of the person in the experience. and focus there instead of on what we think the answers are.
Right.
And I think that will go a long way to us being able to find solutions to this problem in the future.
Well, I can talk about how hard that is, just running a podcast as a person and a therapist. It's the stories in our head and the associations we have, very powerful. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to inhabit the mind of somebody else, especially when it's painful.
Yeah.
It's much easier to try to join them as they describe their fantastic honeymoon in Tahiti. It's another when they're describing something horrendous.
Yeah, I think just in general, we want to push this problem away. You know, we want to believe that this is a problem that only ever happens to other people, right? And in reality, we really do have a pretty high tolerance for violence in families. You know, we
also have some statistics that it happens to anybody, right?
Yes, absolutely. This does not discriminate. It doesn't matter what neighborhood you live in, what zip code, how much money you make or don't make. And it's pretty equally distributed. The domestic violence calls in the greater Rochester community are much higher than any other county outside of New York City's counties. So our area has a particularly big issue with domestic violence. And those are only the calls to law enforcement, which is but one measure. And it's not necessarily the most accurate measure, but it's the only measure we have. So we have a very serious issue with domestic violence here. You know, every neighborhood is seeing this problem. And given that we are still in the throes of this pandemic, domestic violence and child abuse both are significant concerns right now for families that have become very, very isolated. And so if you have a friend or somebody who maybe you haven't connected with in a while and you are concerned about them, you know, you certainly don't lead with this kind of question, but to call and check in on them and listen carefully to what they may say, and whether or not there's some way you can help them could be really, really valuable right now.
Well, thank you so much for your vulnerability and telling your story, your honesty, and coming on the show a second time.
Well, I appreciate you having me back. We had a great conversation the first time, but it was very clear when I listened to it that it didn't express what I really wanted to convey about the issue. So I thank you for allowing us to re-record it. This feels better.
I had a stronger feeling of joining with you, and in the simplest sense, I feel I understood what you were talking about better. It's also more emotionally potent for me. And that concludes another episode from Season 2 of OnListening. Thank you for joining us. Please check out our webpage, onlistening.net, and subscribe. Please leave reviews on your favorite podcasting site. It helps me make a name for this. I don't have corporate sponsorship, and all my guests are providing their time free, so there's no way to advertise this program other than word of mouth and your ratings. Email me, comments or questions, dan@onlistening.net. Thank you so much for joining again. Take care.